I'm Melissa, 29, and 3 days ago I was planning my husband's surprise 30th birthday party. Now I'm standing in the charred remains of our dream home, staring at the empty brackets where our smoke detectors used to be. The fire chief just told me something that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Johnson, these alarms were professionally removed less than 24 hours before the fire started. My husband died in his sleep from smoke inhalation, but someone wanted to make sure he never woke up. As I piece together the evidence, I'm discovering that his death wasn't an accident, and the person who killed him has been sitting at my kitchen table, offering comfort and casseroles. Like and subscribe if you've ever discovered that the people closest to you aren't who they seem, because what I found next will shock you. Just 4 days ago, I thought I had the perfect life. My husband and I had been married for 3 years, and every morning I'd wake up in our beautiful 2-story colonial house thinking about how lucky I was. We'd spent 2 years renovating that house together, choosing every paint color, every fixture, every piece of furniture with such care. The kitchen had white marble countertops that gleamed in the morning sun, and French doors that opened onto our garden where we planned to grow old together. That Tuesday night, I was staying at my sister's house across town. We were planning his surprise birthday party, and I needed to coordinate with the caterer and decorator without him overhearing our phone calls. Around 9 p.m., he texted me, "Miss you already. Can't wait to see what you're plotting for Saturday. Love you more than words can say." I smiled and texted back heart emojis, telling him I'd be home Thursday morning. I was sound asleep when my phone rang at 3:17 a.m. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about the late hour made my heart start racing before I even answered. "Is this Melissa Johnson?" a gruff voice asked. "Yes, who is this?" "Ma'am, this is Captain Rodriguez with the fire department. I'm calling about a house fire at 1247 Maple Street. Your husband has been transported to General Hospital." The words didn't make sense. House fire? Our house? I kept asking the captain to repeat himself, but the information remained the same. By the time I threw on clothes and raced across town, the ambulance was already pulling away from what used to be our home. The entire second floor was gone. Black skeleton beams reaching toward the sky like burned fingers. The smell of smoke and melted plastic hung thick in the air, mixing with the acrid scent of wet ash from the fire hoses. A paramedic met me at the hospital with the news that would change everything. My husband had died from smoke inhalation before the flames ever reached the bedroom. He never woke up, they said. Never had a chance to escape. As I sat in that sterile waiting room, clutching the wedding photo I'd grabbed from my sister's house, all I could think was how he must have been dreaming about his birthday party when the smoke quietly filled his lungs. The next morning, Fire Marshal Thompson called and asked me to meet him at the house. I dreaded going back there, but I needed answers. When I arrived, he was standing in what used to be our living room, holding a clipboard thick with forms and photographs. His expression was serious in a way that made my stomach clench. "Mrs. Johnson, I need to ask you some difficult questions," he said, his voice gentle but professional. "This fire wasn't accidental." The word hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" He led me through the destruction, pointing out evidence I never would have noticed. Burn patterns on the walls showed the fire had started in 3 different locations simultaneously: the living room, kitchen, and basement. Someone had poured accelerant throughout the house, creating a trap designed to spread flames quickly and block escape routes. "Here's what concerns me most," Marshal Thompson said, pointing to the empty brackets on the wall where our smoke detectors used to hang. "These weren't damaged by the fire. They were removed. We found them in your garbage can outside, with the batteries taken out. The removal happened yesterday afternoon around 2 p.m., based on your neighbor's security camera footage." My hands started shaking. Someone had deliberately removed our smoke detectors, knowing my husband would be sleeping upstairs that night. Someone wanted to make sure he wouldn't wake up when the smoke started filling the house. "Who had keys to your house?" Marshal Thompson asked. I thought carefully. "My husband and I each had a key, plus we kept a spare hidden under a fake rock by the front door. I'd given keys to my sister for emergencies, and my husband's brother had one from when he house sat for us last year. Then there was Brenda, our neighbor across the street, who had a key because she watered our plants when we went out of town. The person who did this knew your schedule," the marshal continued. "They knew you wouldn't be home Tuesday night, and they knew your husband would be alone upstairs. This was planned, Mrs. Johnson. Someone studied your routines and waited for the perfect opportunity." As we walked through the burned remains of my life, I couldn't stop thinking about that list of people with keys. 4 people had access to our house, and one of them was a murderer. When I got back to my sister's house that afternoon, Brenda was waiting on the front porch with a covered casserole dish in her hands. She'd been our neighbor for 2 years, a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled gray hair and an abundance of opinions about everyone else's business. I'd always found her a bit intrusive, but she seemed harmless enough. "Oh, honey," she said, wrapping me in a hug that lasted longer than felt comfortable. "I'm so sorry about your husband. Such a tragedy. Such a young man with so much to live for." She followed me inside without being invited and immediately started bustling around my sister's kitchen like she owned the place. The casserole was tuna noodle, my husband's least favorite food, though I'd never told her that. She pulled out dishes and started serving herself while talking non-stop about the fire. "I saw the flames from my bedroom window around midnight," she said. "By the time I called 911, the whole second floor was already engulfed. It went up so fast, faster than any house fire I've ever seen. Must have been all that expensive furniture you two bought. Those fancy materials burn quick, you know." Something about her tone bothered me. She seemed almost excited talking about the fire, like she was discussing a movie she'd enjoyed rather than the death of my husband. And how did she know about our expensive furniture? We'd never invited her inside our house beyond the front entryway. "The insurance company is going to pay out big on this one," she continued, spooning more casserole onto her plate. "Houses like yours, with all the renovations and upgrades, probably worth close to $500,000 now, right? Plus your husband was so young and successful. I bet his life insurance policy was substantial." I stared at her. We'd never discussed our finances with Brenda, yet she seemed to know details about our insurance coverage and property value that even some of our close friends didn't know. Her interest felt predatory, like she was calculating something in her head while she spoke. "How do you know about our insurance?" I asked. She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh, honey, everyone in the neighborhood talks about these things. Property values, insurance costs, it's just normal conversation. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was. I'd lived in that neighborhood for 3 years, and I'd never had conversations with anyone about insurance policies or property values. As Brenda continued talking, describing the fire in unsettling detail, I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew far more about our situation than any neighbor should. The police released my husband's personal belongings 3 days after the fire. His wallet, watch, and phone had been in the bedroom nightstand and survived with minimal damage. As I went through his wallet, looking for nothing in particular, I found something that stopped me cold, a small brass key I'd never seen before, tucked behind his driver's license. When I asked the bank about it, they confirmed it opened a safety deposit box my husband had rented 6 months ago. I had no idea it existed. We'd shared everything in our marriage, or so I thought. The bank manager led me to the vault, and with shaking hands, I opened the box. Inside were documents that revealed a completely different picture of our financial situation. My husband had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy just 6 months ago, naming me as the sole beneficiary. The monthly premiums were being automatically deducted from a business account I didn't know existed. There were also real estate investment documents showing properties worth nearly $800,000 that he'd purchased without telling me, but the most disturbing discovery was a small appointment calendar, filled with entries in my husband's handwriting. Meetings with people I'd never heard of, phone calls scheduled at odd hours, and several entries that simply said, "BC, urgent," with dates and times. The most recent entry was from 2 weeks ago, "BC threatening again. Need to handle this soon." My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. Someone had been threatening my husband, and he'd been scared enough to document it but not scared enough to tell me or go to the police. The initials, BC, appeared dozens of times over the past 3 months, always with notes like, "Demand's getting worse," and "Can't keep this up much longer." At the bottom of the safety deposit box was a manila envelope containing $50,000 in cash. And a handwritten note, "If something happens to me, this money isn't from anything illegal. I was trying to protect our future, but I think I made a mistake trusting the wrong person. The threats are getting worse. I love you, Melissa. J." I sat in that bank vault and cried, realizing my husband had been living in fear for months. Someone had been threatening him, demanding something from him, and he'd been handling it alone rather than involving me or the authorities. Now he was dead, and I was holding evidence that his murder had been planned for months. The question was, who was BC, and what had they wanted from my husband badly enough to kill him for it? My husband's business partner, Greg, agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown. I'd called him that morning, asking about the mysterious appointments and the initials, BC, from the calendar. Greg had been my husband's partner in their consulting firm for 4 years, and if anyone knew about business threats, it would be him. When Greg walked in, he looked terrible. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He ordered a double espresso and sat across from me, fidgeting with his coffee cup instead of making eye contact. "I've been dreading this conversation," he said without preamble. "I knew you'd eventually ask about the business problems." "What business problems?" I asked. "My husband never mentioned any issues with the company." Greg's laugh was bitter. "Your husband was protecting you from a lot of things, Melissa. Our company was in serious financial trouble. We'd taken out loans to expand too quickly, and when several major clients pulled their contracts last year, we couldn't make the payments. We were facing bankruptcy." He pulled out a folder containing business documents and loan agreements. The numbers were staggering: over $300,000 in business debt, with personal guarantees that meant both partners were liable for the full amount if the company failed. "About 6 months ago, we got approached by some investors who seemed too good to be true," Greg continued. "They offered to pay off all our debts in exchange for a majority stake in the company. Your husband was suspicious from the beginning, but I was desperate. I pushed him to consider it." "Who were these investors?" "That's where it gets complicated. The lead investor was a woman named Beverly Crane. She claimed to represent a development group interested in our client list and business connections. But your husband did some digging and found out the company was connected to some questionable land development deals. Money laundering, possibly." Beverly Crane. BC. The initials from my husband's calendar suddenly made sense. "Your husband wanted to turn down the deal and find another way to save the company," Greg said. "But Beverly didn't take rejection well. She started making threats about what would happen if we didn't cooperate. She knew things about our personal lives that she shouldn't have known. Where you worked, your daily schedule, even details about your house." My blood ran cold. "She was watching us?" "I think so. Your husband became convinced she was dangerous, but he didn't want to scare you. He started meeting with her regularly, trying to negotiate some kind of compromise. But she kept escalating her demands." Greg showed me the business contract Beverly had proposed. It wasn't just an investment deal, it was essentially a takeover that would have given her complete control of the company and access to all their client information. My husband's signature line was blank, but there was a note in the margin: "No deal. Find another way." "The last time I spoke to your husband was 2 days before the fire," Greg said. "He told me he was going to the police about Beverly's threats. He said he'd rather lose everything than get involved with criminals." I should have supported him, but I was too scared of losing the business. As Greg spoke, I realized my husband had died because he'd tried to do the right thing. Beverly Crane had killed him to stop him from exposing her operation, but I still didn't understand how she'd gotten access to our house or why the fire had been set on that specific night. That evening, my husband's brother called. His voice was slurred, and I could hear the clink of ice in a glass as he spoke. The conversation quickly turned hostile when I mentioned the life insurance policy and the real estate investments. $2 million, he spat into the phone. $2 million, and he never said a word to family. "But I bet you knew all about it, didn't you, Melissa?" "I didn't know about any of it until today," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm just as shocked as you are." "Right. Just like you didn't know he changed his will 6 months ago, cutting me out completely." This was news to me. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb. He removed me as a beneficiary from everything, the house, the business, even his personal accounts. Said he was restructuring his financial obligations and that family members needed to stand on their own feet. Those were his exact words." The bitterness in his voice was palpable. My husband had never mentioned changing his will, but it aligned with the timeline of the insurance policy and real estate investments. 6 months ago, something had changed in my husband's financial planning, and he'd made decisions that affected his entire family. "He owed me money," his brother continued. $15,000 from when I helped him buy his first business equipment. He promised he'd pay me back when the company took off, but instead he got rich and forgot about family. Then he has the nerve to cut me out of his will because I asked for what was rightfully mine. I'd never heard about any loan between the brothers. My husband had always been careful with money and generous with family, but he'd never mentioned lending money to or borrowing money from relatives. "When did you last talk to him?" I asked. There was a long pause before he answered. 2 weeks ago. We had dinner, and I confronted him about the money. He got angry and said some things, told me I needed to get my life together instead of relying on handouts. Said if I didn't stop gambling and drinking, he wasn't going to enable me anymore. "You have gambling debts?" Another pause. "That's none of your business. The point is, my brother abandoned his family when we needed him most. And now you're sitting on millions of dollars while the rest of us struggle." The call ended abruptly when he hung up on me, but the conversation had revealed several disturbing facts. My husband's brother had serious financial problems, felt betrayed by recent changes to the will, and had a key to our house from when he'd house sat for us the previous year. He also knew our routines well enough to know when I'd be away overnight. More troubling was the timeline. His angry dinner with my husband had happened 2 weeks ago, right around the time my husband made that final entry in his calendar about the threats getting worse. Had the threats been coming from family as well as from Beverly Crane? And if his brother was desperate enough for money, was he desperate enough to commit murder for an insurance payout he thought he deserved? 3 days later, I received a call from Patricia Wells, an investigator with the insurance company. She wanted to meet in person to discuss the claim, which she explained was standard procedure for any policy over $1 million. We met at her office downtown, where she had a conference table covered with photographs, documents, and a thick file with my husband's name on it. "Mrs. Johnson, I need to show you some surveillance photos that our investigation has uncovered," she said, spreading several black and white images across the table. "These were taken by a security company in your neighborhood over the past month." The photos showed a figure in dark clothing near our house at various times of day. In one image, the person was crouched by our front door. In another, they were standing in our backyard, apparently looking through windows. The timestamps showed the surveillance had been happening for weeks leading up to the fire. "We've been investigating unusual activity around your property since your husband increased his life insurance policy," Patricia explained. The timing of the policy change, combined with the suspicious nature of the fire, raised red flags in our system. She showed me more photos taken during the day, showing the same figure approaching our house when both my husband and I would normally be at work. In one particularly clear image, I could see the person had something in their hand that looked like keys. "Here's what concerns us most," Patricia said, pointing to a photo taken the afternoon before the fire. "This image shows someone entering your house at 2:17 p.m. with what appears to be a toolbox. They stayed inside for approximately 45 minutes. The timestamp matches exactly when the fire marshal determined your smoke detectors were removed." My heart was pounding as I studied the photo. The figure was wearing a baseball cap and dark jacket, making identification difficult, but something about their build and posture seemed familiar. "Do you recognize this person?" Patricia asked. I stared at the image, trying to identify the familiar elements. The way they walked, the height, the general body shape, it reminded me of someone, but I couldn't quite place it. "We've also discovered that your husband contacted our fraud department 2 weeks before his death," Patricia continued. "He was concerned that someone might try to file a false claim on his policy. He specifically asked what security measures were in place to prevent fraudulent payouts." This was another piece of information my husband had kept from me. He'd been worried enough about insurance fraud to contact the company directly, which meant he'd suspected someone close to him might try to benefit from his death. "Based on our investigation," Patricia said, "we believe your husband's death was part of a planned insurance fraud scheme. The question is whether he was a willing participant who changed his mind, or an unwilling victim from the beginning." She showed me the final photo in the series, an image taken at 11:30 p.m. the night of the fire, just 17 minutes before the fire department received the first emergency call. The same dark figure was captured leaving our house through the back door, moving quickly toward the street. "Whoever did this knew your husband's schedule, knew when you'd be away, and had unrestricted access to your house," Patricia said. "This wasn't a random crime or a crime of passion. This was methodically planned by someone who understood your daily routines and had been watching your house for weeks." Detective Morrison called me that morning with news about my husband's phone records. The police had been able to recover deleted text messages from his phone, including conversations that painted a terrifying picture of his final weeks. "Mrs. Johnson, I need you to come to the station," Detective Morrison said. "We found text conversations that show your husband was receiving threats from multiple sources. This changes the scope of our investigation significantly." At the police station, Detective Morrison showed me printouts of recovered text messages from my husband's phone. The first set was from an unknown number that had been texting him for 3 months. "You can't avoid this forever. Pay what you owe or face the consequences. Your wife has a lovely routine. Would hate for something to happen to her. Last warning. We know where you live, where you work, where she works. Make the right choice." My husband's responses showed his growing desperation. "I told you I need more time. The business is struggling. Please leave my wife out of this. I'll find the money somehow. I can't get that amount in cash without raising suspicions. Give me 2 more weeks." The final message in this thread was from the day before the fire. "Time's up. You had your chance to do this the easy way." "There's a second thread that's even more disturbing," Detective Morrison said, showing me another set of messages. These were from a different unknown number, and the tone was more personal, more vindictive. "You think you can just cut family out like we're nothing? I know about the insurance policy. $2 million while your brother struggles to pay rent. Maybe it's time you learned what real consequences look like. My husband's responses to these messages were angry. You need help. This isn't about money anymore. I'm not enabling your gambling addiction. Get professional help. If you threaten my family again, I'm calling the police. The final message in this thread was chilling. You won't call anyone. You'll be too busy dealing with your own problems. We traced both numbers to burner phones purchased with cash, Detective Morrison explained. But we did find something interesting. The second number was activated at a store just 3 blocks from your brother-in-law's apartment building. The purchase was made with cash, but the store's security camera caught the transaction. She showed me a grainy security camera image of someone buying a phone at a convenience store. The person was wearing a baseball cap pulled low, but I could see enough of their profile to confirm what I already suspected. There's one more thing, Detective Morrison said. Your husband's final outgoing text message was sent at 11:22 p.m. the night he died. It was sent to you, but it never went through because of a network error. We recovered it from his phone's memory. She handed me a printout of the message. Melissa, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I've been getting threats for months. I should have told you, but I wanted to protect you. The people threatening me know about our house, our schedules, everything. One of them has been watching us. I think they're going to try something tonight. I love you. I'm sorry I wasn't braver. Jay, my husband, had known he was in danger that night. He'd tried to warn me, but the message never sent. He died alone and afraid, knowing that someone was coming for him, but unable to reach me for help. As I sat in that police station, reading his final words, I realized that my husband had spent his last months living in terror, protecting me from threats I didn't even know existed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something had been nagging at me about Brenda's behavior, and I decided to do some research. I started with public records, searching for information about her property, finances, and background. What I found was shocking. Brenda's house, which she'd always claimed to own outright, was actually in foreclosure. She owed over $180,000 in back mortgage payments and had received a final notice of foreclosure 3 months ago. Her credit report showed maxed out credit cards, defaulted business loans, and a bankruptcy filing that had been dismissed for incomplete paperwork. But the most disturbing discovery was her business history. Brenda had been involved in several failed real estate development projects, all of which had ended in lawsuits and financial losses for investors. Her most recent venture was a company called Crane Development LLC, and suddenly the connection became clear. Beverly Crane, the woman who had been threatening my husband's business, wasn't just connected to Brenda. Beverly Crane was Brenda. I found articles in the local business journal about Crane Development's latest project, a luxury shopping complex planned for our neighborhood. The development required acquiring several residential properties, including the entire block where our house sat. Properties that weren't for sale would need to be acquired through eminent domain or motivated by other circumstances. A property search revealed that Brenda had been quietly purchasing houses in our neighborhood for the past year, using shell companies and investors to hide her involvement. She'd managed to buy 3 of the 7 houses on our block, but she needed all of them to make the development project viable. Our house, with its prime corner location and large lot, was essential to her plans. The timeline was becoming clear. Brenda had been watching our house and studying our routines not just for weeks, but for months. She'd cultivated a friendship with us, positioned herself as a helpful neighbor, and gained access to our house through the spare key arrangement. When my husband's business ran into financial trouble, she'd seen an opportunity to acquire both his business and his property. Her threats to my husband hadn't just been about money, they'd been about forcing him to sell our house to her development company. When he'd refused and threatened to go to the police, she'd realized she could get the property and the insurance money by eliminating him entirely. I found the final piece of evidence in property tax records. Brenda had already filed preliminary paperwork to purchase our house from the estate, claiming she had a verbal agreement with my husband to sell before his death. She'd been so confident in her plan that she'd started the legal paperwork before the fire even happened. As I sat in my sister's living room at 2 a.m., surrounded by printouts and legal documents, I realized that Brenda hadn't just killed my husband, she'd been planning it for months. Every casserole she'd brought, every neighborly conversation, every offer to help with yard work had been part of an elaborate plan to gain access to our house and our lives. The woman who had been sitting at my kitchen table, offering comfort and support, was the same woman who had removed our smoke detectors and set the fire that killed my husband. She'd been playing the role of grieving neighbor while calculating exactly how much money she'd make from my husband's death. I knew I needed evidence that would hold up in court, so I called Detective Morrison and asked about setting up surveillance. She agreed to help me gather proof of Brenda's involvement, but warned me that any confrontation needed to be carefully controlled to ensure my safety. The next day, I installed a hidden camera in my sister's living room, positioned to record anyone who came to visit. I also started wearing a small recording device whenever I expected to see Brenda, hoping to catch her in inconsistencies or admissions. Brenda showed up that afternoon with another casserole, this time chicken and rice. As usual, she made herself at home in the kitchen and started talking about the fire. But this time, I was ready with specific questions. "Brenda, you mentioned seeing the fire from your bedroom window," I said, watching her face carefully. "But your bedroom faces the back of your house, away from our street. How could you have seen the flames from there?" For just a moment, her expression faltered. Then she laughed and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh honey, you're confused. I saw the fire from my living room window when I got up to get a glass of water. I must have misspoken before. But I knew the layout of her house from visiting once when she'd locked herself out. Her living room window faced the opposite direction from our house. There was no angle from which she could have seen our fire from inside her house at midnight." "It's strange that you called 911 so quickly," I continued. "The fire department said the first call came in at 11:47 p.m., just minutes after the fire started. You must have incredible timing to notice it so fast." "Well, I'm a light sleeper," she said. But her voice had an edge now. "And I've always been very observant about neighborhood safety. That's why I keep such good records of who comes and goes on our street." "What kind of records?" She realized she'd said too much. "Oh, just mental notes. You know how it is, you notice patterns, like when people leave for work, when they come home, that sort of thing." I pressed further. "The police told me someone had been watching our house for weeks before the fire. Taking photos, noting our schedules. Did you ever notice anyone suspicious around our property?" Brenda's hands started shaking slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "No, I never saw anyone like that. Although I did notice you were staying at your sister's house more often lately. I worried something might be wrong between you and your husband." "How did you know I was staying at my sister's?" I noticed your car wasn't in the driveway some nights. I pay attention to these things because I care about my neighbors. But my car had been parked in my sister's garage every night I'd stayed there. The only way Brenda could have known I wasn't home was if she'd been actively checking whether lights were on in our house or monitoring our movements more closely than any normal neighbor would." "Brenda," I said quietly, "do you know what's going to happen to our property now that my husband is gone?" "Oh, I couldn't even think about that right now," she said, but I caught a flash of something, eagerness, in her eyes. "I'm sure you'll figure out what's best when you're ready to make those decisions. Actually, I've been getting calls from developers who want to buy the house. Apparently our lot is valuable for some kind of shopping complex project. One company called Crane Development has been particularly persistent." Brenda went completely still. "I've never heard of that company." "Really? They seem to know a lot about our neighborhood. They mentioned that several houses on our block have already been purchased for development. They even knew specific details about our property value and insurance situation. Developers are always circling like vultures after tragedies," she said, standing up abruptly. "You shouldn't talk to them. They'll try to take advantage of your grief." As she gathered her things to leave, I noticed her hands were visibly trembling. She'd gone from confident and chatty to nervous and eager to escape in just a few minutes of specific questioning. The woman who claimed to know nothing about development projects or property surveillance had revealed that she knew far more than any innocent neighbor should. Detective Morrison called me early the next morning with breakthrough news. The financial investigation had uncovered bank transfers that connected Brenda directly to my husband's brother, proving they had been working together. "We found electronic transfers from an account linked to Beverly Crane, your neighbor Brenda, to your brother-in-law's personal checking account," Detective Morrison explained when I met her at the police station. 5 payments of $3,000 each over the past 2 months, all with memo lines that say, "consulting services." She showed me the bank records spread across her desk. The payments had started 3 months ago, right around the time my husband's calendar showed the threats were escalating. The final payment was made 2 days before the fire, accompanied by a transfer memo that read, "Final payment upon completion." "Your brother-in-law has been working as Brenda's inside source," Detective Morrison continued. "He provided her with information about your husband's schedule, your travel plans, and details about your house's security system. But more importantly, he's the one who physically removed the smoke detectors." The detective showed me cell phone records proving that my husband's brother and Brenda had been in constant contact for months. On the day of the fire, they'd exchanged 17 text messages, coordinating the timing down to the minute. "We also found something else," she said, pulling out a plastic evidence bag containing a small electronic device. "This is a Wi-Fi security camera that was hidden in your house's garage. It was streaming video directly to your brother-in-law's phone, allowing them to monitor when you and your husband came and went. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. My husband's own brother had been spying on us for months, selling information about our private lives to the woman who was planning to kill my husband. The $15,000 debt he'd mentioned was a lie. He'd actually been paid $15,000 by Brenda to help with the murder. Here's how we think it worked, Detective Morrison explained. Brenda recruited your brother-in-law months ago when his gambling debts made him desperate for money. She paid him to provide information about your husband's business problems, your daily routines, and your house's layout. When your husband refused to sell the property or cooperate with her development plans, she decided to eliminate him and collect the insurance money. The detective showed me more evidence, photos of my husband's brother entering our house during work hours, text messages discussing which nights I'd be away, and even floor plans of our house that he'd drawn for Brenda, marking the locations of smoke detectors and escape routes. Your brother-in-law disabled the security system, removed the smoke detectors, and left the back door unlocked for Brenda on the night of the fire, Detective Morrison said. He was supposed to leave town immediately afterward and establish an alibi, but his gambling addiction got the better of him. He spent the night at a casino, and the security cameras there proved he was in the area when he claimed to be out of state. The final piece of evidence was a recorded phone conversation between Brenda and my husband's brother, captured by the police surveillance. In it, they discussed how to split the insurance money once I received the payout, and Brenda's plans to purchase our house from me at below market value during my time of grief. My husband had been murdered by his own brother for money, and I'd been comforting myself with casseroles made by his killer. The two people who should have been supporting me through this tragedy had been the architects of it all along. Detective Morrison and I developed a plan to gather the final evidence needed for prosecution. She wanted a recorded confession from Brenda, something that would seal the case and prevent any possibility of the charges being reduced or dismissed on technicalities. The plan was risky, but it was our best chance to get justice for my husband. We need her to admit to planning the fire and removing the smoke detectors, Detective Morrison explained as she fitted me with a sophisticated wire system. The recording device was tiny, no bigger than a button, with a transmitter that would send everything directly to the police surveillance van. We also need her to acknowledge the conspiracy with your brother-in-law. The financial records are strong evidence, but a confession will make the case ironclad. The plan was more complex than I'd expected. I would invite Brenda over for what she would think was a grief counseling session, but I'd steer the conversation toward topics that might make her reveal details about the murder. Detective Morrison had coached me for hours on specific phrases and questions that would encourage Brenda to brag about her plan without making her suspicious. Remember, your safety is the priority, Detective Morrison warned as she tested the recording equipment one final time. If she becomes suspicious or aggressive, use the safe word we discussed, lighthouse, and we'll be inside in seconds. Don't try to be a hero. We just need her confession, not a confrontation. Detective Morrison and two other officers would be stationed in an unmarked van outside my sister's house, monitoring the conversation in real time and ready to move in if things went wrong. They'd also positioned additional officers around the neighborhood, disguised as utility workers and joggers, in case Brenda tried to run. When Brenda arrived that afternoon, she seemed more relaxed and confident than she'd been during our previous conversations. She brought homemade chocolate chip cookies and a bottle of wine, settling into the living room chair like she belonged there. Her demeanor was almost celebratory, as if she was finally comfortable that her plan had worked. "You look like you're doing better," she said, studying my face with what I now recognized as predatory satisfaction. "Sometimes the worst grief hits after the shock wears off, but you seem to be handling everything remarkably well. I'm proud of how strong you've been. I've been thinking a lot about what you said regarding property developers," I began, following the script Detective Morrison and I had practiced. "You were right that they're like vultures circling after tragedy. But I'm curious about something. How did you know so much about development projects in our neighborhood? You seem to have very specific knowledge about property values and market conditions." "Oh, you pick up information here and there when you've lived somewhere as long as I have," she said casually, sipping her wine. "I've seen enough families go through difficult times to recognize the patterns. Developers always swoop in when people are vulnerable. The thing is, I've been getting very specific offers," I continued, watching her face for any tells. "Companies that know details about our house's value, our insurance situation, even our mortgage terms. Information that would only be available to someone who had access to private financial records or inside knowledge of the insurance industry." Brenda's expression didn't change, but I noticed her hands had started fidgeting with her wine glass, rotating it slowly on the table. "Developers do their research. They probably pulled public records, talked to real estate agents, that sort of thing. It's amazing what information is available if you know where to look. Actually, I've learned something interesting about property development law, I continued, following Detective Morrison's script. Did you know that if someone dies in a house fire caused by criminal negligence, it can affect property titles and development rights? The land becomes tied up in legal proceedings for years, sometimes decades. I wouldn't know anything about that, Brenda said, but her voice had gotten tighter and more controlled. Unless, of course, the fire was planned in a way that would allow for quick resolution of the estate, I pressed on. If the property owner died without any evidence of criminal intent, and if the surviving spouse was motivated to sell quickly. Due to grief and financial pressure, a developer could acquire the property within months instead of years. It's actually quite clever, from a business perspective. Brenda stood up suddenly, her wine glass clattering against the coffee table. I don't like where this conversation is going, Melissa. I came here to offer support, not to listen to conspiracy theories about property development and insurance fraud. Sit down, Brenda, I said firmly, channeling every ounce of strength I had left. Or should I call you Beverly? Because I know about Crane Development, and I know about the payments to my husband's brother, and I know you killed my husband to get our property. For a moment, she looked like she might run for the door. Then something changed in her expression, a cold calculation that made my blood freeze. Instead of panic or denial, I saw the look of someone who had been caught but was calculating whether she could talk her way out of it or if she needed to eliminate another problem. You think you're so clever, she said, sitting back down with deliberate calm. Fine. Let's talk about what really happened. Your husband was a stubborn fool who couldn't see a good business opportunity when it was handed to him on a silver platter. I offered him a fair deal for his property, and he refused out of some misguided sense of principle. She was confessing, and the wire was recording every word. I forced myself to stay calm and keep her talking, despite the terror I felt seeing this cold, calculating side of her. So you decided to kill him for it? I decided to solve a problem that was costing me everything, she said matter-of-factly, as if we were discussing the weather. Do you have any idea how much money I had invested in this development project? How many investors were counting on me to deliver the properties I'd promised? Your husband's refusal to sell wasn't just inconvenient, it was going to destroy everything I'd worked for my entire career. How long had you been planning it? Months. I tried everything else first, reasonable offers, financial pressure through his business, even direct threats. But he was too stubborn and too principled for his own good. So I reached out to his brother, who was much more practical about family loyalty versus financial necessity. You paid him to help you murder his own brother? I paid him to provide information and access, she said with a shrug. The rest was just logistics. Remove the smoke detectors, disable the security system, make sure you weren't home that night. Your husband died peacefully in his sleep, he never even woke up. It was actually quite merciful, compared to what could have happened. The casual way she discussed my husband's murder made me sick, but I needed her to admit to the specific details that would ensure her conviction. You were in our house that afternoon, removing the smoke detectors yourself. Your brother-in-law was too nervous to handle the technical aspects, she said with obvious disdain. He gave me the keys and the security codes, but I had to do the actual work. Poor man was shaking so badly I thought he might have a heart attack before we even got started. Some people just aren't cut out for serious business. She'd confessed to murder, breaking and entering, and conspiracy. Everything was being recorded, and Detective Morrison would have enough evidence to put both Brenda and my husband's brother away for life. But I needed one more piece, proof that she understood exactly what she had done. My husband knew you were planning to kill him, I said. He tried to text me that night, but you disabled our communications. He died knowing someone was in the house, knowing he was trapped. That was unfortunate, she said, showing the first flicker of something that might have been remorse. I'd hoped he would never wake up. But business is business, Melissa. Sometimes good people get caught in situations that are bigger than they are. Your husband was in the way of something important, and he made the choice not to cooperate. The consequences were his own responsibility. For a moment, she looked like she might run. Then something changed in her expression, a cold calculation that made my blood freeze. You think you're so clever, she said, sitting back down with deliberate calm. Fine. Let's talk about what really happened. Your husband was a stubborn fool who couldn't see a good business opportunity when it was handed to him. I offered him a fair deal for his property, and he refused out of some misguided sense of principle. So you decided to kill him for it? I decided to solve a problem that was costing me everything, she said matter-of-factly. Do you have any idea how much money I had invested in this development project? How many investors were counting on me to deliver the properties I'd promised? Your husband's refusal to sell wasn't just inconvenient, it was going to destroy everything I'd worked for. She was confessing, and the wire was recording every word. I forced myself to stay calm and keep her talking. How long had you been planning it? Months. I tried everything else first: reasonable offers, financial pressure through his business, even threats. But he was too stubborn. So I reached out to his brother, who was much more practical about family loyalty versus financial necessity. You paid him to help you murder his own brother? I paid him to provide information and access. The rest was just logistics. Remove the smoke detectors, disable the security system, make sure you weren't home that night. Your husband died peacefully in his sleep, he never even woke up. It was actually quite merciful. The casual way she discussed my husband's murder made me sick, but I needed her to admit to the specific details that would ensure her conviction. You were in our house that afternoon, removing the smoke detectors yourself. Your brother-in-law was too nervous to handle the technical aspects. He gave me the keys and the security codes, but I had to do the actual work. Poor man was shaking so badly I thought he might have a heart attack before we even got started. She'd confessed to murder, breaking and entering, and conspiracy. Everything was being recorded, and Detective Morrison would have enough evidence to put both Brenda and my husband's brother away for life. 2 days later, Detective Morrison called with the plan for the final sting operation. The insurance company had agreed to cooperate by creating a fake insurance payout notification, telling me that the $2 million claim had been approved and would be available for pickup at the bank. The plan was to lure both Brenda and my husband's brother to the bank, where they expected to collect their share of the money. We've set up surveillance throughout the bank and the surrounding area, Detective Morrison explained. Both suspects believe they're going to walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars. Instead, they're going to walk into federal charges for insurance fraud, conspiracy, and first-degree murder. The fake insurance check was impressive. It looked completely authentic, complete with official letterhead and security features. The bank manager, who was cooperating with the police, had even prepared a special account and documentation to make the setup convincing. I was terrified about seeing both of them again, knowing what they'd done, but Detective Morrison assured me that I'd be completely protected. You'll be in the bank for less than 10 minutes, she said. Just long enough to establish that you're picking up the insurance money. They'll approach you afterward, expecting their cut, and that's when we'll move in. The morning of the operation, I could barely eat breakfast. My hands were shaking as I got dressed, knowing that in a few hours, my husband's murderers would finally be brought to justice. I drove to the bank in my own car, followed discreetly by unmarked police vehicles. Inside the bank, everything proceeded according to plan. The bank manager, Mr. Peterson, handed me a folder containing the fake insurance documentation and walked me through the procedures for accessing the money. I played my part, asking questions about tax implications and withdrawal limits, making it seemed like I was genuinely planning to access the funds. As I left the bank, I saw Brenda's car parked across the street. She was sitting behind the wheel, watching the bank in trance with intense focus. According to the plan, I was supposed to drive home and wait for her to make contact about collecting her share of the money. I didn't have to wait long. My phone rang before I even reached my sister's house. "Melissa, honey, I heard some wonderful news." Brenda's voice was sickeningly sweet. "Word around the neighborhood is that your insurance claim got approved. That must be such a relief for you." "How did you hear about that?" I asked, though I knew the police had deliberately leaked the information to test whether she was still monitoring my activities. "Oh, you know how news travels in small communities. I'm so happy for you. But I imagine handling that much money must be overwhelming. If you need any advice about financial planning or property decisions, I'd be happy to help." "Actually, I could use some guidance," I said, following the script. "Could you come over this afternoon? Maybe bring your expertise about property values we discussed before." "Of course, dear. I'll be right over." An hour later, Brenda arrived with my husband's brother in tow. I hadn't expected to see him, and the sight of his face made me sick. He looked nervous and guilty, fidgeting with his hands and avoiding eye contact. "I brought some additional expertise," Brenda said, gesturing to him. "Family should be involved in important financial decisions, don't you think?" They sat on my sister's couch like they belonged there, both watching me with predatory anticipation. Detective Morrison and her team were positioned outside, waiting for the signal that would bring this nightmare to an end. "So, about this insurance money," Brenda began, her mask of sympathy finally slipping completely. She opened her briefcase and pulled out what appeared to be legal documents and a calculator. "I think we need to discuss how to handle the practical aspects of your situation, and some obligations you might not be aware of." What do you mean? I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. Well, there are people who helped make this outcome possible, she said, glancing meaningfully at my husband's brother. People who took significant risks and deserve to be compensated for their contributions to resolving your family's financial problems. My husband's brother finally spoke up, his voice shaky but determined. I helped you get through this tragedy, Melissa. I provided emotional support, family guidance, and I even helped with some of the practical arrangements after the fire. I think I deserve something substantial for my support during this difficult time. You want money from my husband's life insurance? I said, making my voice sound shocked and confused. Money from the policy on your own brother? It's not about the money, Brenda said smoothly, spreading the documents across the coffee table. It's about fair compensation for services rendered. I provided you with guidance and support during your darkest hours. I brought you meals, offered counseling, helped you navigate the insurance process. Your brother-in-law gave you family support when you needed it most. Surely that's worth something substantial. She pulled out a typed document that looked like some kind of contract. I've taken the liberty of drawing up a fair compensation agreement. It outlines the services provided and suggests appropriate payment for those services. How much are you talking about? I asked, leaning forward to look at the papers. Brenda leaned forward as well, her eyes gleaming with greed. I think $500,000 would be appropriate compensation for my consulting and support services. And another $200,000 for family support services would be fair for your brother-in-law's contributions. $700,000? I said, letting my voice rise with apparent outrage. That's more than a third of the entire insurance payout. Consider it an investment in your future security, Brenda said, and now her voice had taken on a threatening edge that made my blood run cold. You don't want to make the same mistakes your husband made. He refused to be reasonable about business arrangements, and look what happened to him. That was the threat Detective Morrison had been waiting for. I reached up and touched my earring, the signal that the confession was complete, and I felt unsafe. But before I could give the final signal, my husband's brother spoke up. Melissa, you need to understand that this isn't a request, he said, his voice getting stronger and more aggressive. We did you a favor by handling this situation quietly and efficiently. Your husband was never going to cooperate with reasonable business arrangements, and his stubbornness was going to cost everyone involved a lot of money. Are you admitting that you killed your own brother? I asked directly. I'm admitting that I helped solve problems that were bigger than any one person, he said, puffing up with what appeared to be pride. Your husband was selfish and short-sighted. He had an opportunity to help family and participate in a profitable business venture, but he chose to be difficult instead. Brenda nodded approvingly. Your brother-in-law understands business realities better than your husband did. Sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect larger interests. You murdered him, I said quietly. You killed my husband for money. We eliminated obstacles that were preventing everyone from achieving their financial goals, Brenda corrected. Your husband chose to be an obstacle. The consequences were his own responsibility. Within 30 seconds of my signal, the front door burst open and Detective Morrison entered with 3 officers, guns drawn. The sound was like thunder in the quiet room. Police. Nobody move. Brenda jumped up from the couch, looking around wildly for an escape route. Her briefcase fell to the floor, scattering papers everywhere. My husband's brother just sat there, his face gray with shock and defeat, like he'd always known this moment would come. Brenda Walsh, you're under arrest for the murder of Jonathan Johnson, arson, insurance fraud, and conspiracy, Detective Morrison announced as she approached with handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. This is entrapment. Brenda screamed as the handcuffs clicked into place. She set me up? I never said I killed anyone. I was just discussing business arrangements. Actually, you did, Detective Morrison replied calmly. 2 days ago, you confessed to planning and executing your neighbor's murder. Today, you attempted to extort money from his widow and threatened her safety. You're going to prison for the rest of your life. As they led Brenda away, she turned to my husband's brother with pure fury in her eyes. This is your fault. If you hadn't been so weak and nervous, if you'd just stuck to the plan, none of this would have happened. You ruined everything. My husband's brother was arrested next, charged with conspiracy to commit murder, breaking and entering, and accessory to arson. As the officers read him his rights, he looked at me with what might have been remorse, but could just as easily have been self-pity. I'm sorry, Melissa, he said quietly as they put the handcuffs on him. I never meant for it to go this far. I just needed the money, and she said it would be quick and painless. I didn't think he'd actually die. You removed the smoke detectors, I said, my voice steady despite the rage and grief I felt. You made sure your own brother would suffocate in his sleep. You killed him just as surely. As if you'd lit the match yourself. I was desperate, he said, his voice breaking. I owed dangerous people money, and they were threatening to kill me. I thought if I helped with this one thing, I could pay them off and start over. I didn't want to hurt anyone. You sold out your own brother for $15,000. I said. You let him die alone and terrified because you couldn't face the consequences of your own choices. As they led him away, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness that was almost overwhelming. Justice was finally being served, but it couldn't bring my husband back. The two people who should have loved and protected him had betrayed him for money, and now they would spend the rest of their lives paying for that choice. Detective Morrison stayed behind after the arrests to make sure I was okay. Are you all right? She asked, sitting down beside me on the couch where the killers had just been sitting. I think so, I said, though I was shaking from the adrenaline and emotion. It's over, isn't it? The arrests are over, she said gently. Now we prepare for trial. But yes, the dangerous part is over. They can't hurt you anymore. As I sat in my sister's living room, looking at the scattered papers from Brenda's briefcase and thinking about everything that had happened, I realized that my husband's death had taught me something important about the people in our lives. The ones who truly love us protect us, even when we don't know we need protection. The ones who betray us reveal their true nature when money and self-interest are involved. My husband had spent his last months trying to protect me from the very people who were planning to hurt us both. Now it was my turn to make sure his story was told and his killers faced justice. The trial began 6 months later, and it was everything Detective Morrison had promised it would be, a comprehensive presentation of evidence that left no doubt about what had happened to my husband. I had dreaded this day, knowing I'd have to face Brenda and my husband's brother again, but I also knew it was necessary for justice to be served. The prosecutor, District Attorney Rachel Martinez, had built what she called an airtight case against both defendants. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records showing the payments from Brenda to my husband's brother, cell phone records documenting their coordination on the day of the fire, surveillance photos showing Brenda entering our house, and most damning of all, the recorded confessions we'd obtained through the police sting operations. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, DA Martinez said in her opening statement, this is a case about greed, betrayal, and murder. The defendants didn't just kill Jonathan Johnson, they destroyed a family, eliminated a man who trusted them, and then attempted to profit from their crime. We will show you exactly how they planned and executed this murder, and how they tried to manipulate the victim's widow into giving them money from his life insurance policy. Brenda had hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to argue that she was a legitimate businesswoman who had been unfairly targeted by an overzealous police investigation. Her lawyer claimed that her conversations with me had been taken out of context, and that she had never actually admitted to murder, only to legitimate business practices that had been misunderstood, but the prosecution had recordings of her detailed confessions, and when they played them in court, the jury's reaction was visible. You could see the shock and disgust on their faces as they heard Brenda casually discussing how she'd planned my husband's death and describing his murder as merciful and just logistics. My husband's brother had taken a different approach, pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for his testimony against Brenda. His defense attorney had negotiated a plea deal that would give him 25 years instead of life in prison, but only if he provided complete and truthful testimony about the conspiracy. When he took the stand, he looked like a broken man. He'd lost weight in jail, his hair had gone gray, and he could barely make eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. But his testimony was devastating to Brenda's defense. She approached me about 6 months before the fire, he said, his voice barely audible. I was desperate for money because of gambling debts, and she offered me a way to make some quick cash by providing information about my brother's business and personal life. What kind of information? The prosecutor asked. Everything. His daily schedule, when he'd be home alone, when his wife would be traveling. Details about their house, the security system, where they kept spare keys, the layout of the bedrooms. She wanted to know about their insurance policies, their financial situation, their marriage problems. Did she tell you why she wanted this information? At first, she said she was trying to make a business deal with my brother and needed to understand his situation better. But as time went on, it became clear she was planning something more serious. She started asking about accelerants, about how fires spread, about smoke inhalation. The prosecutor walked him through the timeline of the conspiracy, showing how the plan had evolved from business pressure to threats to murder. My husband's brother described how Brenda had gradually escalated her requests, asking him to install surveillance equipment, to disable security systems, and finally to remove the smoke detectors. Why did you agree to remove the smoke detectors? DA Martinez asked. She told me it was just to scare him, he said, finally looking up at the jury. She said if he woke up to smoke in the house but couldn't find the source because the detectors weren't working, he'd be frightened enough to cooperate with her business demands. She said no one would actually get hurt. But you knew she was planning to set a fire. Yes, he whispered. I knew. And you knew your brother would be sleeping in the house. Yes. And you removed the devices that would have warned him about the fire and given him a chance to escape. Yes. His voice broke. Completely. I killed my own brother for $15,000. When it was time for victim impact statements, I had prepared extensively, but nothing could have prepared me for the emotional weight of speaking directly to my husband's killers. I looked at both of them as I approached the microphone, and neither could meet my eyes. My husband was a good man who trusted the wrong people, I began, my voice steady despite the emotion I felt. He trusted his neighbor to be a friend, and she spent months planning his murder. He trusted his brother to be family, and his brother sold him out for gambling money. He died alone and afraid because the people who should have protected him chose money over his life. I described the months of living with the knowledge of how my husband had been betrayed, the nightmares about his final moments, and the way their crimes had destroyed my faith in the people around me. But I also talked about the strength I'd found in seeking justice, and my determination to make sure other families didn't suffer the same betrayal. My husband spent his last months documenting threats and gathering evidence because he knew something was wrong, I continued. He was trying to protect both of us from the very people who were planning to kill him. In the end, his careful documentation helped ensure that his killers would face justice. Even in death, he was still protecting me. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all charges, I felt a sense of relief and closure that I hadn't experienced since the night of the fire. Brenda was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. My husband's brother received 25 years, which meant he wouldn't be eligible for parole until he was in his 70s. As the judge read the sentences, I thought about my husband and how proud he would have been that justice had been served. The people who had betrayed him would spend the rest of their lives paying for their choices, and other families would be protected from their greed and violence. 1 year after the trial, I found myself in a place I never expected to be, not just surviving, but actually beginning to heal. The journey from victim to survivor had been longer and more complicated than I'd imagined, filled with setbacks and small victories, moments of rage and unexpected peace. I'd started seeing a therapist specializing in trauma and betrayal, Dr. Sarah Chen, who helped me work through the complex emotions of discovering that the people closest to my husband had been his killers. The hardest part wasn't just the grief of losing him, but the complete shattering of my ability to trust people's motives. Betrayal trauma is different from other kinds of loss, Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. When someone you trust hurts you, it doesn't just affect your relationship with that person, it affects your ability to trust your own judgment about people in general. She was right. For months after the trial, I found myself analyzing every interaction, looking for hidden motives in every act of kindness. When neighbors brought food or offered help, I wondered what they really wanted. When new people tried to befriend me, I questioned whether they had ulterior motives. The paranoia was exhausting, but Dr. Chen assured me it was a normal response to what I'd experienced. Slowly, with therapy and time, I began to rebuild my ability to trust, starting with small gestures and gradually working up to deeper relationships. My sister had been my anchor throughout everything, never wavering in her support, and she became my model for what genuine loyalty looked like. 6 months after the trial, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to create a memorial garden in my husband's honor, but not at our old house, which had been demolished after the fire. Instead, I purchased a small plot of land in the community garden downtown, a place where my husband and I had volunteered together on weekends. The memorial garden became a project that helped me channel my grief into something positive. I planted his favorite flowers, sunflowers, which always made him smile, and lavender, which reminded me of our honeymoon in France. I installed a small bench with a plaque that read, "In memory of those taken by betrayal, and in honor of those who seek justice." Working in the garden became my meditation, my way of connecting with my husband's memory while also creating something beautiful for the community. Other people who had lost loved ones to violence began visiting the garden, and it became an informal support network for survivors of crime. The garden also became a place where I could reflect on the lessons I'd learned from my husband's death and the investigation that followed. I realized that my husband had been braver than I'd initially understood. Yes, he had tried to protect me by handling the threats alone, but he had also been documenting everything, gathering evidence, and preparing to go to the police. In his own way, he had been fighting back against his killers. Through therapy, I learned to stop second-guessing his decisions and instead to honor the courage it had taken for him to try to handle such a terrifying situation. He had been dealing with threats from multiple sources: his business associate Beverly Crane, his own brother, and creditors who were pressuring him through family connections. The fact that he had managed to document as much as he did while living in fear showed incredible strength. I also began speaking at community events about trusting your instincts and recognizing warning signs of manipulation. My experience with Brenda had taught me that predators often position themselves as helpers, offering support and comfort while they gather information and plan their attacks. The person who killed my husband spent months bringing me casseroles and offering neighborly advice, I would tell audiences. She positioned herself as my closest friend during my grief, all while calculating how to profit from my husband's death. Trust your instincts about people who seem too helpful, too interested in your personal business, or too eager to offer unsolicited advice about major life decisions. These speaking engagements became another form of healing for me. By sharing my story, I was ensuring that my husband's death had meaning beyond the punishment of his killers. If I could help even one person recognize the warning signs of manipulation or trust their instincts about someone who seemed too good to be true, then something positive would come from our tragedy. I also became involved with victim advocacy groups, helping other families navigate the criminal justice system and understand their rights during investigations and trials. Detective Morrison connected me with several organizations that needed volunteers who understood what it was like to lose someone to violent crime. Working with other victims' families showed me that everyone's journey through grief and justice is different, but there are common threads. The need to feel that your loved one's death mattered. The importance of having their story told accurately. The desire to protect other families from similar tragedies. One of the most meaningful connections I made was with a woman whose elderly father had been killed by a neighbor who wanted to acquire his property for development. The similarities to my case were striking, and we ended up working together to push for legislation that would require more oversight of property development deals and stronger protections for elderly and vulnerable homeowners. As the first anniversary of my husband's death approached, I realized that I had not just survived the worst year of my life, I had found purpose in it. My husband's death had revealed the worst in people, but the aftermath had also revealed the best. The police officers who worked tirelessly to solve his case, the prosecutor who fought for justice, the therapist who helped me heal, the community members who supported the memorial garden, all of these people had shown me that there was still goodness in the world. On the anniversary itself, I spent the morning in the memorial garden, tending to the flowers and reflecting on everything that had happened. I thought about my husband and how proud he would be of the way I had fought for justice. I thought about the evidence he had gathered that ultimately helped convict his killers. And I thought about the new life I was building, different from what we had planned together, but meaningful in its own way. As I sat on the bench in the garden, surrounded by the flowers we both had loved, I realized that healing didn't mean forgetting or moving on, it meant carrying forward the best parts of what we had shared while building something new from the strength I had discovered in myself. 2 years after my husband's death, I stood in the doorway of my new home, holding the keys and taking a moment to appreciate how far I'd come. The house was smaller than the one my husband and I had shared, but it was mine in a way that felt different, chosen not as part of a couple's dream, but as a reflection of who I had become as an individual. The new house was in a different neighborhood, one where I didn't have to drive past the empty lot where our dream home had once stood. It had a small garden in the back where I could grow the flowers that reminded me of my husband, and a front porch where I could sit in the evenings and watch the world go by without wondering which neighbors might have ulterior motives. My new neighbors were lovely people who respected my privacy while also making it clear that I was welcome in their community. There was no Brenda-like figure hovering with casseroles and unsolicited advice. Instead, there were normal people living normal lives, offering the kind of genuine friendship that develops naturally over time. I had left my old job at the marketing firm 6 months after the trial, realizing that I needed work that felt more meaningful after everything I'd experienced. I now worked for a nonprofit organization that helped crime victims navigate the legal system and connect with resources for healing and recovery. The work was emotionally challenging, but it gave me a sense of purpose that I'd never found in corporate marketing. My role involved training police officers and prosecutors on how to work effectively with victims' families, drawing on my own experience to help them understand what families need during investigations and trials. I also helped develop educational materials about recognizing financial crimes and property fraud, hoping to prevent other families from falling victim to schemes like the one that had cost my husband his life. The transformation in my career had been gradual but profound. Where I had once focused on selling products and building brand awareness, I now focused on protecting people and building systems that could prevent tragedies. The skills were transferable: communication, research, project management, but the motivation was completely different. I had also become something I never expected, a public speaker. What had started as occasional talks at community events had evolved into a regular part of my work. I spoke at law enforcement conferences, victim advocacy seminars, and community safety forums, sharing my story and the lessons I'd learned about trust, betrayal, and resilience. My husband's murder taught me that evil often wears a familiar face, I would tell audiences. But it also taught me that justice is possible when good people work together, and that healing is possible even after the worst betrayal. The person who killed my husband underestimated two things: my husband's intelligence in documenting the threats against him, and my determination to see justice served. These speaking engagements had connected me with other survivors of violent crime, and many of them had become close friends. We formed an informal network of people who understood what it meant to have your life completely disrupted by someone else's violence, and who had found ways to rebuild meaningful lives from the pieces. One of the most important relationships in my new life was with Detective Morrison, who had become not just a professional contact but a genuine friend. She invited me to help train new detectives on working with victims' families, and I learned about law enforcement from the inside. Understanding how investigations work, and seeing the dedication of officers like Detective Morrison, had helped restore my faith in institutions and systems. You know, Detective Morrison had told me recently, your case changed how I approach investigations. Seeing your strength throughout the process, and the way you contributed to solving your husband's murder, reminded me that victims' families are partners in seeking justice, not just people we need to handle carefully. I had also reconnected with some old friends who had supported me through the worst of my grief but whom I had pushed away during the investigation. My trauma response had been to isolate myself, to trust no one, but therapy had helped me understand that healing required letting people back and gradually. My sister remained my closest confidant and strongest supporter. She had been my rock throughout everything, never wavering in her loyalty or her belief that justice would be served. Our relationship had actually grown stronger through the tragedy, and I now understood the difference between family bonds that are based on genuine love and family relationships that can be compromised by greed and selfishness. The insurance money from my husband's policy had eventually been paid out, after the criminal cases were resolved and the insurance company completed their investigation. I had used part of it to buy my new house, but the majority went into a foundation I established in my husband's name, focused on helping families affected by property-related crimes and supporting research into preventing financial fraud. The foundation also funded the community garden where I had built the memorial, ensuring that it would remain a place of healing and reflection for other families dealing with loss. Seeing other people find comfort in the space my husband and I had created together gave me a sense of continuity, a feeling that our love story had contributed something positive to the world despite its tragic ending. On weekends, I volunteered at the garden, teaching children about plants and helping other community members with their plots. It was peaceful work that connected me to my husband's memory while also connecting me to the living community around me. As I settled into my new house, arranging furniture and hanging pictures that reflected my journey rather than just my past, I realized that I had become someone I wouldn't have recognized 3 years ago. The woman who had stood in the ruins of her burned house, devastated by betrayal and loss, had transformed into someone stronger, wiser, and more purposeful. I wasn't the same person I had been when I was married, and I wasn't trying to be. That woman had been part of a partnership, defined by shared dreams and mutual support. The woman I had become was defined by her own choices, her own strength, and her own mission to prevent other families from experiencing what I had endured. But I carried the best parts of my marriage with me: my husband's integrity, his careful attention to detail, his belief in doing the right thing even when it was difficult. These qualities had helped solve his murder, and they continued to guide my new life. As I sat on my new front porch that evening, watching the sunset and feeling genuinely peaceful for the first time in years, I thought about how my husband would feel about the woman I had become. I knew he would be proud of how I had fought for justice, honored his memory, and built something meaningful from our tragedy. The keys to my new house were more than just keys to a building, they were symbols of my freedom from the past, my readiness for the future, and my ability to create safety and happiness on my own terms. I had survived the worst thing I could imagine, and I had not just survived, I had thrived. Like and subscribe if you believe that even the darkest betrayals can't destroy someone who refuses to give up on justice and healing. Because sometimes, the people who try to break us actually reveal strengths we never knew we had, and sometimes the worst chapters of our lives become the foundation for our most meaningful ones.